of them. They often disagree. Most of them think that if medication works for you, then great, you choose that. But they object to it being imposed on people and things like that. But there are some disagreements about just how strongly people should reject medication. So also at the same time in the 1970s, I don't know, is anybody here familiar with the Willowbrook State School?
No, it was closed down in Staten Island because they were refusing their.
Right, so guess what the Willowbrook State School is now today? College of Staten Island.
I was going to say CUNY's.
College of Staten Island. So you know Geraldo Rivera?
That's funny.
The journalist Geraldo Rivera, he's often on Fox News. This is really how he got famous, was through his expose of the Willowbrook State School. I'm just going to play. This is actually just a preview. The whole thing is available on YouTube. Rivera put out this story called The Last Disgrace about Willowbrook. He was the journalist who broke the story. Well, so I'll play for you.
6 years since Robert Kennedy walked out of one of the wards here at Willowbrook and told newsmen of the horror he'd seen inside. He pleaded then for an overhaul of the system that allowed retarded children to live in a snake pit. But that was way back in 1965, and somehow we all forgot. I first heard of this big place with a pretty sounding name because of a call I received from a member of the Willowbrook staff, Dr. Michael Wilkins. The doctor told me he'd just been fired because he'd been urging parents with children in one of the buildings, building number 6, to organize so they could more effectively demand improved conditions for their children. The doctor invited me to see the conditions he was talking about, so unannounced and unexpected by the school administration, we toured building number 6. The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible. There was one attendant for perhaps 50 severely and profoundly retarded children, lying on the floor naked and smeared with their own feces. They were making a pitiful sound, the kind of mournful wail that it's impossible for me to forget. This is what it looked like, this is what it sounded like, but how can I tell you about the way it smelled? It smelled of filth, it smelled of disease, and it smelled of death. We've just seen something that's probably the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life. Is that typical of ward life? Yes, there are 1,300 patients.
So Willowbrook was originally built to accommodate something over 1,000 people. And by the time Rivera aired this story, they had 5,000. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was always uncertain about this. After Willowbrook was shut down, where were the patients?
So this is part of what's been called the deinstitutionalization movement, and it includes both people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, but also people with mental disabilities. After this expose, there was a push, and because of the psychiatric system survivors movement, there was a push to deinstitutionalize people. And most of the people from Willowbrook were discharged into group homes of various kinds, smaller community settings. There were a few smaller institutions, somewhat more home-like, but bigger than just a house. Some of those are now being closed down because the state of New York is trying to get rid of institutions with more than like 50 or 60 people on this idea that those aren't homes, those are still institutions. Many of my students, I teach also in the Disability Studies Master's course, and many of my students have had Willowbrook survivors in the homes, the group homes that they oversee, and they talk about some of the behaviors and so on that many of these Willowbrook survivors had as a result of being so long in Willowbrook. It affected them for the rest of their lives. Now, the 25th anniversary of Willowbrook of this report spurred a kind of re-look. And there's another, if you look on YouTube, there's another documentary, Willowbrook 25 years later, and interestingly, they interview Rivera, and he cries when he talks about when he did this, when he went to Willowbrook and did this story. He still can't, he did there in his report, but to this day he cannot talk about that without crying at just how horrible it was. Around the same time, and we're still in the 1970s, and this is relevant to what we just saw, a number of Scandinavian scholars, including Wolfensberger, who was the scholar who was biggest in the United States, started pushing for what they called normalization. And normalization meant that we should offer people with developmental and intellectual disabilities the opportunity to have what would be considered a normal life in a society. So it's culturally specific, right? It depends on which society you're in, exactly what that's going to look like. But if people in a society get jobs and they get married and so on, then that's the kind of life that should be available to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so that's, in many ways, normalization is the philosophy that still dominates today in the field of people working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. As we'll see, however, much of the rest of the disability rights and activist community is opposed to normalization. Right? That, as we saw in our discussion a little bit earlier of the neurodiversity movement, they don't want to be normal. Right? They don't want necessarily, they want to call into question what counts as normal. So you can see there another tension in the disability movement between people who advocate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and other parts of the disability community. So now that brings us to more recent protests, the ADA, ongoing campaigns, and we're going to touch a bit on intersectionality. The disability rights activist movement is often traced to 1988, the Gallaudet University protest which is a university for deaf students. And Gallaudet University was in the process of hiring a new president, and they chose a hearing president. And the students went nuts, and they protested, and the administration of the university was forced to back down and choose another candidate. The first candidate, or the first deaf president, they hired the first deaf president of Gallaudet University as a result of that protest. This is often, this helped to inspire the disability protest movement, which is a bit ironic because, as I note here, many deaf people began arguing around this time that deafness is not a disability, but an ethnicity or a culture, right? That it's not, so what's interesting is that in spite of the fact that many deaf people, and we use capital deaf to refer to deaf culture, many lowercase deaf people and argued that deafness was uppercase deaf, the culture, and refused to identify as disabled. And yet, their protest helped to spur on other people with disabilities to fight for their rights as well. A little bit about intersectionality. It turns out that, you may not be aware of this, but many people mistakenly think that sign language is a universal language. But it isn't, in fact. It varies by culture. There's French Sign Language, there's Spanish Sign Language, there's American Sign Language, that's ASL. And in the United States, because many deaf students in the South in particular, black deaf students, went to segregated schools, they also tended to develop their own sign language. And so there developed what's now being called Black ASL, Black American Sign Language. And scholars are beginning to study differences between Black ASL and the dominant American Sign Language in the United States. That, of course, the fact that many Black deaf students were not taught standard ASL led to some terrible effects, of course, because when some of those schools closed, or if students were forced out of those schools, they had no way of communicating with anybody else, not even other deaf people. And so they often ended up isolated. Aravelis and Miniar, two scholars, talk about the story of one young man named Junius Wilson, who was from a poor Black family. And he tended to be very huggy, but they argue that because he was Black and deaf, he was interpreted as dangerous, and so he ended up being castrated to stop him from being dangerous, and he spent 3/4 of his life locked up in an institution. And part of what happened to him was that he was forced out of one of these Black deaf schools and then had no way to communicate with anybody. And so that isolation increased his vulnerability to this kind of abuse on the part of the system. So then we turn to the fight for the ADA in earnest, which